All right, so here's something that might be of particular interest if you're doing graphics like annotations for a cartoon, some bubbles, you know, pow or bang, or all sorts of explosive expressions. And this is something I'm just laying out in the curve tool. You can click here to add additional points. This is a tutorial in of its own. But what I'd like to do is focus on the how to create the gradient that will fill this, right? Because we can render a brush along that. That would be this tool here, and it will use the current brush. And in fact, let's go and store that. So I'm going to store this image because I'll probably use that again to fill it. There's other things you can do with it. Other than filling it, you can also fill it with a gradient, and whatever the gradient is, it will fill it right there. Right. So how do we define this gradient? Like for instance, if I have a gradient with if I have a background image with something in between there, let's say I go to render plasma noise there, and maybe even colorful. There you go. And now I render along this curve with I fill it with the gradient. You notice one thing. First of all, there are some color changes, but there's also opacity involved. This gradient has some parts where it's still transparent and it's not actually changing the color. It's showing through there, right? So a gradient can have color changes, but it can also have opacity changes. And I want to explore a little bit some of the tools that we have to define your own gradients. So one thing that we can do is the gradient. Go here to the gradients. Now you see that typically whenever there is a tool that has options for filling potentially with the gradient, and that would be the curve tool has that option, right? Because you can go right there to fill it. You also have the fill tool. For instance, if I go to the fill tool right there, and I still have this image of the drawn curve, there too I have the gradient options and the fill settings. Those two you really want to be aware of. If you use anything to fill, you want to know what fill mode do you use. You have a couple of options for fill, such as if you choose this and you need to have a pattern defined, let's say pattern for instance, right? Then you can go and fill right in there. Right, and then the other mode, there's another group which is gradient fill. So you can fill with a pattern or you can fill with a gradient. And for instance, you go from left to right. Now in this case, it's not going to do much because it's already got a color and I'm giving it very little tolerance. If I give it more tolerance, then it's going to go. And again, you see that there is some areas where it's not actually changing the color, but for most of it, the gradient is imposing itself all over. The area here where it's not, it's because the gradient itself has some transparency. So some parts of it is opaque on the edges, and some part of it is transparent just around here. So again, how do we change that? How do we define our own gradient? Here it is. There's a gradients control, and this one actually brings up a couple of predefined gradients, and there are two more options here to define your own. All right, in earlier versions there was just one, and we called it the gradient editor. We actually renamed it to the sweep editor, and that's this one here. If I click on that, you'll see and you'll probably recognize it. All right, so that's one of them. You can also access these, by the way, from the window menu, and there it is. There's the sweep editor. Always had the shortcut P as in playtime, or I don't know actually what the P stand for, but I always figured it's playtime. Play with your colors. And then gradient editor, that's the new one. So what you see here is the gradient that has the color changes we're going through right there, from red to something, nothing, because it's transparent, so we don't change it. It leaves it white because it's already white. And then back here we have the cyan and eventually the purple colors. All right, so let's see, how do we work in this one? Well, this one you can easily grab those markers. You can delete this. You can add new ones just clicking on the inside of the gradient and then change the color, and in no time you'll have your new color definitions. All right, so you can also change the mode from linear to cosine or cubic, a couple of other choices there. Now I don't want to explore that much on this tool because this is, well, that kind of deserves its own tutorial really. What I want to do though is go back to the sweep editor because that one has a lot of really interesting capabilities too. By the way, you don't see this one yet. When you click here, it is now applying it, and you still have the the tolerance you could change here. Yep, now it's going all over. So if I keep the tolerance back to 0, I clear. There you go. So now you have that gradient there. Right, so here's the sweep editor. Again, where do we see that? We see it in the fill tool. We see it in the curve tool when you go to fill. There's another place too, and that's in the brush for the particle brushes. Right, you'll see the particle brushes. Let's pin this one down. And you can see that the particles are drawn with that gradient. Right, and so there's a couple of different choices. They're all black here because I cleared them. And when you click on that gradient, you now get to the sweep editor. There are a couple of predefined brushes, predefined gradients, and when you choose this one here, you have 8 to choose from. And if you load a preset, it may typically also reset the gradient going with it. So in fact, it chooses a whole category of gradients. There are some predefined gradients. So click on that, and you'll see the sweep editor. Right, so with the sweep editor, how do you set the colors in here? Well, there's a couple of ways. One of them, as I mentioned, you have 8 different gradients predefined, and you can load another set of 8. Okay, so here you choose one of the 8 that are currently available, and you have the little pull-down menu here for the additional options. Let me move this up here so we'll see the whole menu. And you can see that you can load. You can change between linear and cubic interpolation of how it's applying that. But, oh, and of course that's not the color being used right now. We want to make sure we're using the same one. Okay, so let's say which one is it. Let's go to the one on the right end. So the last one here, number 8, or number 7 since it starts at 0. So now we have this particular gradient going from white through dark and back to white. All right, and we have some shading. Let's get rid of that so we really see the full color. All right, so let's see how we can change the colors on this gradient. For one, there's an area at the bottom here with the graduated lines here, the grids, the tick marks. What you can do is you can set the color at any of these locations. So what you do is you click here, for instance, right, and then you can say what color you want there. All right, so that will set the color at that location, and you can move that around. So that marker, that point marker there, you can relocate it. Let's say click here, put it blue there. Right, click on the right edge, just on the very edge there, and make it white. Now if you want to drop it, if you don't want it, you just drag it out, move it outside, and it goes back to a default, which is white. All right, so you can always work with this. Is sort of the hotspot area. You can place some pointers right there, but you can also drag them from your color swatch over here. This is what we call the color swatch or color well, and you can click that, like the cyan color here, click and drag it, and you can drag it right on here. Okay, and then you can take another one, let's say this brownish color, click and drag it and put it right there. Okay, and then let's do that one more time with the cyan. Oh, we got cyan already. Let's get this pink and put the pink right there on the left edge. All right, so I'm gonna go close, but not too close. I don't want to lose it. I want to keep it on there, right there where it's, oh, I guess I lost it. No, I must be outside of it. There you go. It's a little bit tricky there. All right, so one thing that you can do is you can also set the colors directly in here. By the way, this drag and drop business, you can do that from these colors here in the color swatch, but you can also do it with the main colors, the primary and secondary colors. So for instance, if you have an orange and you have a right click here, blue, you can take this blue and drop it right in there, right? And then the orange, you can put it right there. So that's one way to change the gradient, is to drag and drop the colors and then maybe rearrange the colors in here, you know, redefine in which order that you see these. And so that's how you can define the gradient. Now there are a lot of predefined gradients. You can load one here. There's a whole group of gradients. Each of these is a group of 8. Right? So let's say you want the sky colors or the reds. Here's some different types of reds. And as you go through that, there's always some sort of a reddish tint. So now how can you change that other than through drag and drop? Okay, we've seen we can take this, like this pink, drag and drop it here. Well, we can change it in other ways. And one way that we can change it, let's go for instance to the first color here and make sure we are looking at that first color. There it is, from white to red to black to gray, from white to red to black to gray. There it is. All right, so we're painting with that in the particles right now. Or if we switch to the fill tool, we're filling with that from white to red to black to gray. Right? All right, so that's our gradient right now. The fill gradient, the particle brush gradient, all the same. It's the gradient. And what I'm going to do now is to look at another way to define the colors, and that is by painting them directly in there. In fact, if you hover over here and you have a give it a second, you'll see the tooltip appear, and it says draw to edit red, green, blue, or value channels. All right, so you can red, green, blue, value. There's also more. There's all of them at the same time, and there's opacity. So you can actually go and change that. And while in all, when it's in all of these, click to add an entry. So when you're in all mode, you can just click here, and you can see how it's adding the entry. Let's see, here's black. Click, and it sets the black marker right there. If you click here, it sets the white marker. Now I don't know when that was added. I don't remember seeing this in earlier versions, but you try that on your current versions of PD Pro, and if that doesn't work, it's possibly that was a feature added relatively recently, you know, in version 7 maybe, or 6, I'm not sure. I'm using version 8 here. And so now what else can we do? You can click in this mode, but you can also look at the value or at the red, green, or blue channels. So what you see here is the evolution of each one of these channels. The red channel, you see it go up and then continuing to go up. Now why is it not staying red? Well, because the green and the blue are also going up. So the green is going here and the blue is going here. Let's say if you didn't have the green, you still have the red and the blue. So let's say if the green goes down, the resulting color is pink, right? Because you got the red and the blue, both of these going up to their max, and at that point it turns pink. So what you can do is you can paint directly in here. You can draw here the evolution of each of these color channels. Let's say you want a lot of red at the beginning, and at the end you want no red. You just drag it down there from the max to the minimum. If you have green and you want it initially very little and then go up and peak here and then come back down to no green, you can do that. And then for the blue, maybe we'll do the opposite. We'll go like so. So now what we have is gradients that go from red and then kind of a green, but there's a little bit of red and a little bit of blue as well, but mostly green. And then there is mostly or only blue at the very end. And notice if it's a little bit choppy here, you can, by the way, you can smooth that. See here, this smooth button. You can click it once, you can click and hold it, and it keeps moving it. You can also switch the gradient. Right now it goes from left to right, red to blue. Switch here, and it goes from blue to red. So this is one way that you can do this little switcheroo of the colors. So if your gradient is not going the right way, you can switch it that way. But that's one place to explore setting your own colors with the gradient. So imagine you want something that has a lot of red at the beginning. Let's say, no, the fireworks, right? Very bright, kind of a blue flash at the beginning. So a lot of blue and go down. And then, excuse me, a lot of blue and then go down. A little bit of green, not really a whole lot. And then really no red at the beginning. But eventually it's going to have a lot. So you have the red like this, you have the green. Actually, you want it kind of a cyan or even a white flash at the very beginning. So you could bring everything up to a max right at the beginning here. So that would be something like this, get the red and then come back up on red. Green is maxed, there you go. And blue is maxed and goes away. So now we have a gradient that would be kind of useful for something like firework or an explosion, or initially it's very bright and there's just like every color, and then it gradually, and it's still very hot and burns blue, and then eventually kind of cools down and turns into a reddish. But even more so, it fades away. So how do we make it go dark or go disappear, basically? What you can do, let me make sure I'm still painting with the particles here. There you go. So this is the gradient we're currently contemplating here. Let me also set the color for erasing to black and erase to that. There you go. So here's the gradient we're currently drawing. Initially it starts in white and then it goes, and let me make the lifespan a little bit bigger here, 55. There you go. All right. So for something like a firework, that might be kind of useful. So how do we make it so that it really actually fades away towards the end when it's getting not only getting dark, let's say the blue is gone, the green goes away, and let's move that a little bit, and then the red, okay, we don't want that much, we want it darker, but we really want it actually to just fade away regardless of what color it goes. And what you can do is you can work with the opacity of the gradient. Right, so there's the opacity channel. Right now it's opaque all over, and what you could do is you could just drop that opacity towards the end. So what happens then is that it's not actually painting it anymore, right? If you draw something on top here, you see it disappear a little bit earlier, right? If you didn't have that opacity go, it would just go a little bit longer. It would continue until the very end. Now this is a shrinking line, so it's also thinning. It's also getting thinner. And if you don't want that shrinking, you could give it something like use the current brush. Well, that current brush is that brick tile I had earlier. So let's go and look at settings and perhaps use some non-custom brush. There you go. Let's make it a little bit smaller also. There. All right. So these are not shrinking, and if I want, I can also use the lines, which are not shrinking, but it's just going to be a little bit faster. And so what else can we do here? It's the opacity, right? We want to work with the opacity to have it go down in the end, even though it's not really shrinking or changing the size of the brush. It sure looks like so, right? Because when we look at this, it looks like these particles are getting thinner and thinner, but they're really just getting more transparent. The opacity is going down to 0. And so that's something you can use for a variety of other effects too, like if you fill something with the fill tool, right? And you have let's say you draw a rectangle, like so, and you fill it, right? Because right now my rectangle is not a plain color fill, it's a fill with the gradient. So one thing that you notice is that towards the end, the opacity coming down, it's actually not filling it anymore. See how it's transparent here? You can see part of it. Let's draw a few more. Let's draw one over there now. So that's because the opacity of this rectangle fill is changing. The gradient has a transparency that's changing over place here. All right. So you can use that for many other effects. You can say, for instance, start it transparent as well. Let's move this a little bit. So now it's a little bit transparent at the beginning, and you see that right there, right around here, you can see through it. And you can even bring down the transparency everywhere here in between as well. So bring something like this there. So there are some parts where it's not going to fill it. And if you use, where's my fill settings, if you use the vertical gradient now, right? So now it's going to fill it that way. So that's something to keep in mind, is that there is a lot of power, a lot of capability is hidden inside the fill tool. The gradient has a lot of power, a lot of capabilities with the gradient, because you can work with that color gradient, but also with the transparency of it. So let's say, for instance, if I smooth this a little bit and now switch from a vertical gradient back to horizontal gradient, right, and I fill it right in here, you see, oh, I wanted to fill actually across that, so undo that and give it a little bit of tolerance. There you go. That's not what I wanted. Okay, let's go like so, and then switch the other way, like so, and perhaps switch it this way. So there's a variety of effects you can get from that. Fill it on top, undo that. Maybe I'll put this this image in a separate layer, so it's always on top of the entire set. So I'm going to add a layer here, right? Put this in there, and then switch back to the first layer down at the bottom. And so I'm going to fill in there all over the place, and not to black though. I don't want to erase to black. So let's change the erase color back to white. There you go. And I'm going to fill right in there. and then I'm going to fill, where's my fill gradient? There it is, gradient horizontal. So this time I'm going to fill it this way. So you see how you can, with the transparency, you can create all sorts of really fancy effects. Let's take another look here. Let's go to perhaps another one of the preset. Let's take this gradient, right? And let's create a couple of areas where the opacity is all the way down. Make sure you're on the opacity here. Let's go with the opacity all the way down, including at the end and on the left side. And now this time I'm going to use not this tool for the gradient fill. I'm going to use, right click on this here. That's another set of gradient tools here, and there's a linear gradient tool, right? So when you use the linear gradient tool, you can drag the gradient all across that rubber band line direction, and you can change the axis and change the direction. And the reason why it's not erasing the edges here is because it's not opaque on the edge, right? So I have some areas on the left and on the right side that are not opaque. If it was all opaque, if the transparency was not there, this is what it would do. You see how it erases to black here and erases to gray, because that's the end color of the gradient. If I don't want to erase it at the end, if I want to contain it only on the inside of my gradient selection, of my region selection, what I'll do is I'll set the gradient to 0 down here, the opacity to 0, the opacity to 0, and then that way it will not draw beyond that. When it reaches the very last color, it will actually leave it alone because the opacity is 0. So that's another place where you can play a little bit here. Let's change the smoothing on that as well, so it's a little bit of a smoother transition. Smooth this even a lot, just click and hold it, and you can see now that there is a smoother transition on that. So a lot of really funky stuff you can do with that simply by working with the colors and the opacity of the gradient. And I thought that was really an important thing to play with and to explore, is how to set the colors in the gradient in the sweep editor here. So you have the color channels you can work with. You have all. Okay, that's also another one here where you can actually set the color simply by clicking right in there, or you can look at the value. That's another mode where you can just set the brightness, kind of the value right there, and the opacity is unaffected. You can still use that, and you can also bring the opacity back down here, and look at that. You can see through it, have a little grid there, or maybe smooth it and partially see through it, right? All sorts of really funky stuff that you can do with that. And so that's that for this little tutorial on the sweep editor. And also we saw another side to it, which is the new gradient editor. So there's a couple of ways to work with these gradients: the gradient editor and the good old sweep editor. All right, thanks for watching.